Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this year's Rayson Huang Lecture. Now, this year, the music department turns 40, so we've officially reached middle-aged. So we decided that to celebrate our middle age, we would actually focus on a piece that is twice as old so that we would feel much younger. So this year is the 80th anniversary of Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time, a work which, as many of you know, was written during the Second World War in a prisoner of war camp. Now, the late Rayson Huang, the former president of the University of Hong Kong and the person who founded the music department, and also the person whom this lecture is named after, would be delighted, I think, at our choice, because he, like many of the musicians that played Messiaen Quartet in that prison camp, also had to run away during the war and try and escape when the Japanese invaded China. He actually escaped to Hong Kong, only to have the Japanese invade again in 1941, 80 years ago. And that cut short his time at the University of Hong Kong. Now, he couldn't carry very much with him. But like the clarinetist who premiered Messiaen Quartet, he carried his instrument with him all the time. He carried his violin with him. What you carry with you all the time in a time of war tells you a lot about what you love. And Rayson Huang absolutely loved music. And so it is really a great honor to remember him in this lecture. Now, Messiaen, of course, couldn't carry his piano with him, or for that matter, a church organ. But he did have a bag. He carried a bag around with him during the war. And when he was put into the prison camp and stripped completely naked, the only thing that he wanted to carry was his bag. He would not let the guards take this bag from him. So the question is, what was in his bag? Well, there were two types of things in his bag. First, he had a collection of scores. This included pieces by Stravinsky and Debussy. And secondly, he had books from the Bible, the Psalms, the Epistles, the Gospel, and more significantly for this lecture, he also had the last book in the New Testament, the book of Revelations. So these were the two things he had in his bag. He had music and he had faith. These were the two most important things for Messiaen. And so in honor of this bag, we're going to structure the Rayson Huang lecture based on these two things, music and faith. We're going to look at the historical context of the quartet, and we're going to think about its theological implications. And to do this, we've entitled our lecture Doing Time, because both the music and the theological content is all about time. It's about time in prison, time in music, and time in the Bible. And we've invited two speakers. Let's welcome them onto our webinar with two speakers. One for each item in the bag. So we have Professor Rebecca Rischin from Ohio University, and she'll be giving us a historical context for the music. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you.
Professor Jeremy Begbie, who will be giving us the theological content of the piece. And we're going to begin with Rebecca. So let's go all the way to Ohio in the United States. And let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. Now, Rebecca is an amazing person. She is an award-winning clarinetist, and she's also an award-winning teacher, and she's also the chair of clarinet and and also the professor of clarinet and the chair of the woodwind division at the University of Ohio there. And even more importantly, for this particular lecture, she is the author of a brilliant book, a groundbreaking book, one could say almost like a definitive book on Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time. This has been translated into many languages, including Chinese, and is currently being adapted as a screenplay and hopefully will become a movie. So that's quite amazing. So you seem like a very amazing person, Rebecca. So it's now over to you. I'm going to send my greetings to you. I wish you were here in Hong Kong. I'm sorry that you can't be here, but thank you so much for waking up so early to give this lecture for us.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much to everyone at the University of Hong Kong. Thank you so much to Jeremy, too. I'm really honored to be here with you all today. And thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to for me, it's the morning. So as Daniel said, Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time for violin, clarinet, cello, and piano is one of the masterpieces of the chamber music repertoire of the 20th century, but it's also one of the great stories of 20th century music. As Daniel said, it was premiered in a prisoner of war camp during World War II under extraordinary circumstances in the middle of winter. It was like -4 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero, very cold Celsius as well. What I'm going to share with you today, it's not a theoretical analysis because, as Daniel said, I'm not a theorist, I'm a clarinetist. It's not a practical guide to the performance of the piece, even though I am a performer. And it's not a musicological study because I'm not really a musicologist either. Really, what it is a story for musicians and non-musicians alike. A story about 4 incredible people who participated in really one of the most remarkable premieres of the 20th century. It's been compared to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring premiere. So it really was an incredible thing. So just to give you a little bit of background, from 1993 to 95, I had the pleasure of living in the incredible city of Paris, a city where Messiaen spent much of his life and where, needless to say, the musical, cultural, artistic history simply defies the imagination. I had the time of my life. I traveled all over Europe. It was fantastic. The purpose of this 2-year stay was to interview eyewitnesses to the creation of the Quartet for the End of Time and to incorporate these observations into my doctoral treatise, where I was a student at Florida State University. And this collection of interviews in connection with the archival research on the prison camp, which I visited in what is today Poland, formed the basis of my research for my treatise. That was originally entitled Music for Eternity, A New History of Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. So I later made revisions and changed the title to For the End of Time, the Story of the Messiaen Quartet, and that was published in 2003 by Cornell University Press and then in paperback in 2006. And of course, it's still in print, and I'm very fortunate, as Daniel said, it's been translated into a number of languages: French, Italian, Japanese, as you know, Chinese, and has also been the subject of several screenplays, and hoping that it will eventually become a motion picture. So this book basically reconstructs the compositional history about the Quartet for the End of Time, about which we'll find there were many myths, things that I proved untrue, and it also explores the biographies of the musicians at the premiere. And their biographies, really are fascinating chapters in themselves. And a lot of the book talks not just about the quartet, but about the extraordinary lives of these 4 musicians. So just a little bit about Messiaen. You probably already know he was born in 1908 in Avignon, France, to Pierre Messiaen, who was a translator of Shakespeare and an English teacher, and Cécile Sauvage, who was a poet. So not surprisingly, Messiaen was drawn to mystery, marvel, and poetry at a very early age. He was also an ornithologist. He loved birds, and a rhythmician, as you may have gathered from hearing the 6th movement of the quartet at the beginning of this webinar. The rhythm in this piece and in Messiaen's works in general is very complicated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. He was also very interesting in that he mixed sounds the way a painter mixes colors, associating certain shades with different modes and chords. And he also drew on Gregorian plain chant, church modes, and ancient Greek and Hindu rhythms. So all this together kind of created an eclectic musical language that was uniquely his. And all of these elements are present in the quartet. So you may have already seen a picture of Messiaen, and I can't show you a picture from my book just because there are copyright issues, but I'll share just a couple of small photos from the internet with you, just so you can see what he looked like at various ages. So you can see at various ages, that's Messiaen. As Daniel said, this piece has a religious basis. It was inspired by the book of Revelation, and its title page alludes to the verse from the 10th chapter of Revelation, in which the angel of the apocalypse raises his hand toward heaven and declares that there will be no more time. But interestingly enough, though it might seem like the idea for the end of time is a play on words with the duration of captivity, Messiaen said that the apocalypse was simply a point of departure, and he based his piece basically on that piece and the instruments and the instrumentalists that he had on hand: Jean Le Boulez, violinist, Henri Acoca, clarinetist, and Etienne Pasquier, cellist. So Messiaen said there was not really a play on words with the duration of captivity, but as I mentioned about rhythm, there is a play on words in regards to beat of equal duration in classical music. So basically, in this piece, Messiaen strove to eliminate our conventional notions of musical time, rhythm and meter, and of past and future. And actually, the number of movements is also symbolic. It also has religious significance. So Messiaen wrote, the number 7 is symbolic. The creation in 6 days sanctified by the divine Sabbath. The 7th day of this repose extends into eternity and becomes the 8th day of eternal light, of unalterable peace. Beautiful statement. So just a few words about the musical content of this piece before we delve into the compositional history and famous premiere. While the piece is written for 4 instruments, violin, clarinet, cello, and piano, they all play together only in 4 movements: 1, 2, 6, and 7. You heard a little bit of 6, in which they all play together. In movement 1, they play together, but they all play various different rhythms. And this movement also has the first incidence of identifiable bird song, which would become a trademark in Messiaen's later compositions. So the first movement, Crystal Liturgy, has blackbird and nightingale calls in it. And as I said, very complicated rhythms. I know from playing this piece that, we had to spend the most amount of time on this first movement and the 6th movement because the rhythm is so complicated. The second movement is called Vocalise, for the angel who announces the end of time. And Messiaen writes that this movement evokes the power of this mighty angel crowned with a rainbow and clothed in a cloud. Messiaen also refers to blue-orange chords in the piano. So again, his association of certain chords with distinct colors. The third movement is called Abyss of the Birds. And again, I'm giving you the English titles rather than the French, just to simplify. But of course, these are originally written in French. This movement is for unaccompanied clarinet. And interestingly enough, Daniel alluded to the clarinetist, Acoca, who had his clarinet with him. And the reason that this movement was the first movement to be written was because Acoca was the only one who had an instrument. And the piece actually started earlier than previous books have claimed. this movement is actually in an ABA form. For those of you who are not musicians, ABA basically means that the outer sections are similar and the inner section is different. So in this movement, the outer sections are very dark and slow and gloomy, and they're supposed to represent the abyss. And the intersection is much faster and sprightly and colorful, and it's supposed to represent the hopefulness of birdsong. Messiaen wrote that birds represent our longing for light, for stars, for rainbows, and for jubilant song. So, you have the gloominess of the abyss of the camp, and then you have the hopefulness of the bird song, which is so beautiful. The fourth movement is really an interlude for violin, clarinet, and cello, and it has melodic recalls that appear in the other movements. It's rhythmically and harmonically the simplest. The fifth and the eighth movements are homages to Messiaen's faith and are solo movements for violin and piano and cello and piano. The fifth movement for cello and piano, and it's called Praise to the Eternity of Jesus, and the eighth movement, Praise to the Immortality of Jesus, for violin and piano. And I know listening to that sixth movement, you probably heard a lot of dissonances, and it may have been very jarring to you. If listening to that sixth movement turns you off at all, I would really recommend that you listen to this fifth and eighth movement, because they are so beautiful. They are homages to Messiaen's faith, and they have beautiful melodies, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I already spoke a little bit about the sixth movement. Messiaen was famous for non-retrogradable rhythms, a very complicated word, which basically means these are rhythms which remain the same, whether read from left to right or right to left, musical palindromes. So just that was a little bit about the piece itself. But as I said, I'm not a musicologist. I'm not a theorist. What I found most interesting about this piece was really even more than the musical content was the story behind its history and premiere. So as I said, this actually began a bit earlier. It didn't begin in the prison camp, Stalag 8A. It actually began in Verdun, a bit earlier, where Messiaen was stationed. He got drafted into the French army, and there he met two musicians, Etienne Pasquier and Henri Akoka, who, along with him, would contribute to the shape of musical history. So Etienne Pasquier was born in 1905 in Toul, France, and he was really a child prodigy. He had two older brothers, Jean, a violinist, and Pierre, a violist, and together they formed the Pasquier Trio, Trio Pasquier, which actually became one of the premier ensembles of its kind, a very famous trio. But he was drafted in 1939, like Messiaen, 9 years after he was appointed principal cellist of the Paris Opera Orchestra, and he was sent to Verdun. And there he was put in charge of 4 other French soldiers, and among them happened to be Olivier Messiaen. It's probably hard to imagine, someone else being in charge of Messiaen. He's the big composer, but Pasquier was actually in charge of Messiaen. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures of the Trio Pasquier, just so that you can see what they look like. So Pasquier was very famous, and he and Messiaen used to go on bird watching expeditions together. Messiaen asked Pasquier if they could do this together so that they could listen to the awakening of the birds at dawn. And Pasquier, I interviewed him several times, and he would recount these episodes to me with humor and affection. So this is what Pasquier said at one interview. "Look, a faint glimmer over there. It's dawn," Messiaen would say. "The moment was still. Then all of a sudden we heard peep, a small cry of a bird giving the pitch like a conductor. 5 seconds later, all the birds started singing together like an orchestra. Listen to them, Messiaen said. They're giving each other assignments. They'll reunite tonight to recount what they saw during the day. So here near Verdun, this chorus of birds would inspire Abyss of the Birds. But in the person of Henri Akoka, it also had a human inspiration. Akoka was born in 1912, but he was actually born in Algeria and emigrated to France. He went to the Paris Conservatory and upon graduation entered into the National Radio Orchestra of Paris. But like Messiaen and Pasquier, in 1939 he was drafted. He was sent to play in a military orchestra in Verdun, and there he met Messiaen and Pasquier. And in Verdun, where listening to the birds had become a daily ritual, Messiaen, prodded by the clarinetist, wrote his famous Abyss of the Birds. But Akoka had not even had a chance to read Messiaen's composition when on May 10th, 1940, Germany launched a blitzkrieg against Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The musicians were forced to flee. They were captured on June 20th by the Germans, and then they were sent on a 43-mile hike to Nancy before being transported to the prison camp in Germany. And this is where Akoka read Abyss of the Birds for the first time. And Pasquier said at one of our interviews, I was the music stand. That is to say, I held the score for him. Akoka would grumble as Messiaen asked for unbelievably high notes. It can't be done, protested Akoka, but Messiaen would listen and say, but yes, you're getting there. So less than 2 months after the German invasion of May 1940, France surrendered. On June 25th, 1940, 5 days after the three musicians had been captured, an armistice was signed. The musicians were sent to Stalag 8A, a German camp for prisoners of war in the town of Görlitz-Moys in Silesia. And I do have a photo for you of the camp. So as you can see, this is Stalag 8A in winter 1940. You can see all the snow, how cold it must have been. So Messiaen's description of his arrival, Daniel alluded to, it's really become a symbol of the composer's triumph. And this is a very famous description. You may already know it, but in case you don't, I'm going to read it to you because it's very powerful. This is what Messiaen said. Upon arriving at the camp of Görlitz in Silesia, called in military jargon Stalag 8A, like all the other prisoners, I was at once stripped of my clothing. Naked, I continued to guard with a fearsome look a satchel containing all of my treasures. That is to say, a little library of pocket orchestral scores that would be my consolation when, like the Germans themselves, I suffered from hunger and cold. This eclectic little library ranged from the Brandenburg Concerti of Bach to the lyric suite of Berg. Aside from some required chores, I was soon able to enjoy relative tranquility, the Germans considering me as someone perfectly inoffensive. Moreover, as they've always respected music, wherever it is to be found, not only did they let me keep my scores, but an officer gave me pencils, erasers, and manuscript paper. So quite an extraordinary story. The name of this officer had never before been mentioned, but in my research I discovered that this man was Captain Karl Albert Brühl. He was a lawyer, and he spoke fluent French thanks to a Belgian mother, and so he could communicate with the French prisoners, which really made a difference. And it was actually due to this one officer that Messiaen got this special treatment, that the musicians found instruments, and that they had a place in which to rehearse. So, given our knowledge of the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II, the kind treatment that these musicians received from this German prison camp official might seem very unusual, if not suspect. However, it's important to remember that, as Daniel said, this was a prison camp. It wasn't a concentration camp. That means that the people sent to Stalag Gate A were not sent there to be murdered. They were just sent there to be imprisoned. Also, Brühl, though he was a German nationalist, was an anti-Nazi. Finally, special treatment of musicians in the German prison camps, perhaps due to Germany's long musical tradition, was not unusual. If you want to be a little cynical, you can also say that as the Germans were hoping that France would collaborate, and as we know it did, it was in their interest to treat the French prisoners well. So with Brühl's assistance, Messiaen was on his way toward realizing the composition of the quartet. But one vital role was missing, a violinist. Well, a man named Jean Le Boulaire arrived and the problem was solved. He was born in 1913 in Saint-Ouen-sur-Seine in France. He went to the Paris Conservatory at the age of 14, but unfortunately he never got his first prize. And when I interviewed him and subsequently corresponded with him, he said that this failure was very difficult to forget. He served in the military twice, from 1934 to 1936, and then again when he was remobilized in 1938. He too was captured in June 1940, sent to Stalag Gate A, happened to find himself in the very same bunk as a certain French clarinetist. Well, guess who? Henri Acoca. And one thing led to another, and instead of a trio, the musicians became a quartet. But you may wonder how they got instruments, right? Acoca was the only one who had his clarinet. Well, it was thanks to Brühl that they all got instruments. Messiaen got a piano, Pasquier got a cello, and Le Boulaire got a violin. And in my book, I recount, how Pasquier played his cello for all the prisoners, and they were so delighted, they wouldn't let him stop. It was such a joyous event. So, music just made such a difference in these prisoners' lives. So, in November 1940, the officers brought in a piano, and I can show you that piano. So, it was an upright piano. It wasn't a fancy grand. The musicians had 4 hours a day to practice, 6 to 10 p.m. They could rehearse and they could practice on their own. As you can imagine, Messiaen's piece really daunted them. Even by today's standards, it's considered a very difficult piece. It requires a ton of rehearsal. But, on these instruments and playing it for the first time, not having any recording to listen to for reference, you can imagine how difficult it must have been. Le Boulaire, the violinist, recalled, the first great difficulty was to read the piece. It wasn't easy. The second was to play it together. Orally, it was very difficult for us to find a straight path in the midst of all these winding roads, in this tangled rhythm, at moments tangled with no point of reference, with no rhythm at all. No longer having our little measure in 4/4 or 3/4 time, we were a little lost. Acoca had also encountered these challenges. The Abyss of the Birds demands very long phrases and crescendi, so it demanded the utmost in breath control. Also extreme softs in the very high register. Even Pasquier admitted that this piece challenged him to his limits. He said, never were such things asked of a cellist before. I had to acquire a new technique in order to play it. But Messiaen, with his faith, was very encouraging, and his presence helped to buoy the spirits of the musicians during these very difficult times. Pasquier said to me, Messiaen would say that one had to believe in the music. He radiated a sort of light. And then he said, I'm going to confess something. I don't believe in God. Yet, when I heard Messiaen's music, I suddenly thought that it was possible that there was something, for thousands of reasons. His way of expressing himself, his kindness, his graciousness, his deep studies of music, his love of birds, of wind, of nature. All this made an extraordinary impression on me. I stumbled upon the question of the divine, but with Messiaen's music, I suddenly said to myself, God. So rehearsals continued for a couple of months, and then Messiaen finally finished the composition. The camp commandant agreed to hold the premiere on January 15th, 1941, during the regularly scheduled time for concerts, 6:00 p.m. And they issued invitations to the prisoners. So this is the invitation, Quatuor pour la fin du temps, première audition. You can see Görlitz here and the date. But as you can see here at the bottom, they misspelled Messiaen's name. So on the cover of my book, we had to cut that off because we didn't want Messiaen's name to be misspelled on the cover of my book, of course. So you may have heard of Messiaen's account of the premiere, very famous, but I'll recount it just in case you haven't. It's really become a legend. This is what Messiaen said. Conceived and composed during my captivity, the Quartet for the End of Time was premiered in Stalag 8A on January 15th, 1941. It took place in Görlitz in Silesia in a dreadful cold. Stalag was buried in snow. We were 30,000 prisoners, French for the most part, with a few Poles and Belgians. The four musicians played on broken instruments. Etienne Pasquier's cello had only 3 strings. The keys of my upright piano remained lowered when depressed. It's on this piano, with my 3 fellow musicians, dressed in the oddest way, I myself wearing a bottle green suit of a Czech soldier, completely tattered, and wooden clogs large enough for the blood to circulate despite the snow underfoot, that I played my quartet for the end of time before an audience of 5,000 people. The most diverse classes of society were mingled: farmers, factory workers, intellectuals, professional servicemen, doctors, and priests. And Messiaen concluded by saying, never before have I been listened to with such attention and understanding. So quite an extraordinary story. But in my research, I actually found out that some of it wasn't true. Because given that the premiere took place in an enclosed military barrack, no more than a few hundred spectators, not 5,000, could have attended. And though Messiaen's piano was sorely inadequate, as I showed you, was just this little upright with keys that stuck, Pasquier, at my interviews, repeatedly affirmed that his cello had all 4 of its strings. So you might wonder why Messiaen would deliberately falsify history. I wondered too. Pasquier thought that it amused him to say that. Later, he speculated that Messiaen's persistent repetition of this story stemmed from his desire to illustrate the hardships that the musicians faced in performing the quartet. I kind of have a different take on it. In perpetuating this legend of the 3-string cello, Messiaen imbued this story with an even greater aura of the miraculous. It's like he imbued the story with the image of birds flying over the abyss, a quartet of musicians rising above the apocalypse, redeeming the earth through music, even though they were playing in bitter cold, tattered clothing and broken instruments. It must have seemed like there was the possibility of resurrection with this musical prayer of a peace. So although Pasquier played on a cello with all 4 strings intact, and though there were several hundred, not several thousand people in the audience, it can be certain, to use the words of writer Hannelore Laurewald, that in Messiaen's memory, a messianic vision of thousands of fellow prisoners stayed alive. But certainly, despite this misreporting, it's very clear that this premiere had an indelible mark on the audience. There was an article published in a French newspaper, Nice Matin, on the 60th anniversary of the premiere by Charles Jourdanet, who was a prisoner in the audience. So I thought I would just read to you his brief recount. This is what he said. A cello solo, then a grand violin solo, with a long ascent toward the high register. These are the final notes that resonate through the quote-unquote concert hall, as well as through the hearts of the listeners. There is silence, then applause. Members of the audience approach the composer on stage. Outside, it is minus 20 degrees Celsius. Inside, despite several primitive heaters, the temperature cannot be more than 5 degrees Celsius. On this memorable day, for the several hundred spectators so honored to witness not just a musical premiere, but a world premiere, it was daily life as usual. 6 o'clock a.m., distribution of ersatz coffee. 8 o'clock to noon, chores. Noon, cabbage soup. 1 to 4 o'clock, more chores. 5 o'clock, more ersatz, along with a little loaf of black bread with a little fromage blanc and quite a bit of grease. Fromage blanc is like a kind of French cheese. Finally, at 6 o'clock, the concert in Barrack 27, the theater. On this cold night, seated on benches in Barrack 27, we listened, some moved by the unexpected fervor, others agitated by rhythms and sonorities to which they were unaccustomed, to the creation of what Messiaen called a great act of faith. The concert was over, but for several of us, a beautiful moment remained in which the awesome young master was surrounded by friends and admirers. Pasquier, in our interviews, echoed this religious theme. He said that the premiere was a miracle that transcended not only place and time, but as Messiaen said, differences in nationality and social class. Pasquier said, everyone listened reverently, with an almost religious respect, including those who perhaps were hearing chamber music for the first time. It was miraculous. These people, who had never before heard such music, remained silent. They sat perfectly still, in awe. Not one person stirred. No doubt they assumed their original personalities afterward, but there they were subject to a miracle, the miracle of the performance of this music. So, what happened afterward? Well, just a month later, Messiaen and Pasquier were liberated due to their notoriety. Messiaen was appointed to a teaching post at the Paris Conservatory, and Pasquier resumed his role in the Pasquier Trio and in the Paris Opera Orchestra. Le Boulaire was liberated a year later, and by an unusual turn of events, became an actor, a very successful actor, under a new name, Jean Lanier. As for the clarinetist, Henri Acoca, well, that's another story entirely. I didn't mention that Acoca was Jewish, and previous history books didn't mention this, and neither did Messiaen. And this is a very important fact, because while Messiaen and Pasquier and the Boulaire were settling back into life in Paris, Acoca and his whole family were fleeing the Nazis. And the tale of their heroic survival, Acoca actually escaped from the camp, has as many twists and turns as the story of the quartet for the end of time itself. But I think I'll save that and let you read about in my book, because I don't want to give away everything, otherwise it won't be any fun for you to read the book. So I know I need to conclude now, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterward, so feel free. So Daniel, I'll turn this over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk and painting a great context for us to understand this piece. We are forever indebted, actually, to your research and the timeliness of your research being able to talk with people like Jean Lanier and also with Etienne Pasquier. So it's an amazing book. And as she says, she hasn't told you everything, so do get it and read it. It's really cool. But we're going to move to Cambridge in the UK now. And hear from Jeremy Begbie. Now, Jeremy is a very dear friend of mine, but he's also the Thomas A. Langford Distinguished Professor in Theology at Duke Divinity School and the MacDonald Agape Director of Duke Initiatives in Theology and the Arts. Oh, that's quite a title. You almost have to have circular breathing just to say that. Anyway, he also has a parallel life in Cambridge because he's a senior member of Wolfson College in Cambridge and an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Music at the University of Cambridge. He's also a professionally trained musician who has performed extensively, mostly as a pianist, but also as an oboist and as a conductor. And he's one of the most prolific scholars that I know. He's written far too many books to recount here, but maybe for this particular lecture, 2 books you might want to read, Redeeming Transcendence in the Arts, Bearing Witness to the Triune God, and Theology, Music, and Time. Also, I should add that we have just edited a book together, and it's really, really good. And it's called Theology, Music, Theology, Music, and Modernity, Struggles for Freedom. And that's just came out in February. But anyway, Jeremy, thank you for being here, for joining us in Cambridge. I very much look forward to your talk on the theological content of Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a delight to be with you and a delight to hear you, Rebecca. Thank you so much. What you've done so tellingly and so effectively, of course, is to widen and deepen our hearing of this remarkable quartet by opening up the historical context that surrounds it. And I'm extremely grateful for that, and of course also for your book, which is wonderful to read. As you might expect, and as Daniel said, I want to widen the vista a bit further by exploring the theological dimensions of this piece, and not only this piece, but other related works. And if I have a thesis, a kind of main point, it's there's more to this piece than meets the ear, which is to say that I think what Messiaen's doing is rather more interesting and provocative than perhaps we might at first think. A word or two to begin with about Messiaen's Catholicism. As Daniel made clear very much in his introduction, Rebecca echoed this as well, his faith, his Roman Catholic faith, is the main wellspring of his creative output. There's no doubt about that. A devout Roman Catholic for most of his adult life. I cannot imagine how anyone, even for a moment, could put my faith in question. The truth is that it is my whole life, my motive for being a composer. Or in another place, the illumination of the theological truths of the Catholic faith is the first aspect of my work, the noblest. So his titles, the biblical quotations, the ascriptions on the score, the spoken commentaries at performances, his writings and his interviews all betray a keenness that the listener doesn't miss the theological undertones and overtones of what they hear. And indeed, he was keen that they would sense something of the presence of God in and through the sounds he conjures up. So whatever our faith convictions may be, this dimension is impossible to ignore, not least in this quartet. 2 things to underline about his faith, or his Catholicism in particular. First, there was nothing eccentric about his Catholicism. He doesn't dabble in any obvious heresy. He doesn't fall out with the Roman hierarchy or any of the other transgressive things we tend to think artists need to do in order to be artists. His theology has distinctive accents, certainly, and they arise largely from the influence of a series of French Catholic revivals in the 20th century, one of which was a fresh engagement with the Bible, with Old and New Testament, something very evident in this quartet, of course. But we don't find him kicking against the central beliefs of Catholicism or treating them as basically impediments. He dwells in them, lives inside them like a guest in a spacious mansion, inviting others to discover the treasures he's found. If there's anything eccentric about Messiaen's engagement with Catholicism, It's the way he weaves it together with, among other things, the techniques of musical modernism, of which more in a minute. Second point to underline about his Catholicism is it's cosmic in scope. It embraces the non-human as well as the human. And in this quartet, the bird song of the fifth movement is the most obvious signal of this. But there are many others. The canvas against which he's always working stretches from creation, the creation of all things, to the recreation of all things. From the first "Let there be" to the dazzling new heaven and earth portrayed at the end of his beloved Book of Revelation, with the person of Jesus Christ standing at the center. So, for Messiaen, Christian faith is essentially about a cosmic drama in which we're caught up, not the psychodrama of the individual. The idea that religion is a private matter confined to the inner life of the individual would be decidedly odd to him. What then of the main theological interest or thrust of this work? Well, Rebecca's set the scene beautifully for that. The piece takes its cue, indeed, from a text in the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation is a book that offers just that, a revelation, an unveiling. It's written to lay bare to a bunch of tiny Christian communities under the brutal pressure of a vast Roman Empire what God is up to behind the scenes and what God will eventually do publicly for them and for the entire cosmos. It's saying, you think this is going on, that's what it looks like. I'll tell you what's really going on. And in chapter 10, we're taken into the heavenly throne room and an angel bursts onto the scene announcing there will be no more time. Messiaen, now imprisoned behind the barbed wire of another brutal empire, Hitler's empire, he seizes on this phrase. And he takes it to mean that eventually time itself will be abolished. As Rebecca's explained, he's not concerned here about the end of time in prison, but the end of time as a dimension of the cosmos. So he could say, my initial thought was of the abolition of time itself, something infinitely mysterious and incomprehensible to most of the philosophers of time. And in this, Messiaen finds consolation, what he calls his glimmer of hope, in the midst of what must have seemed hopeless surroundings in many ways. He seems to envisage eternal life with God, the final future of believers, as a life entirely without time, timeless. So, as far as the music is concerned, it's not surprising to find much that seems to press against what we associate with time. Hence the way in this and in many other works, Messiaen distanced himself from musical techniques that drive the listener forward, techniques so basic to Western music. So much Western music sets up patterns of tension and stress that need to be resolved. And so Western music will pull you in and pull you forward, making you want and desire the next thing. For Messiaen uses many techniques that work against that. Hence also the way in which the 8 movements of this quartet don't really make an obvious sequence. There's no obvious pressure from one movement to the next. Little sense that this has to follow that. Hence, too, the way that Messiaen likes to separate rhythm and meter. His rhythms, as Rebecca said, are indeed complex. And in a lot of music, you'll have complex rhythms, but underneath you'll have a steady meter, that is a steady pattern of beats, 2s and 3s and 4s, typically. For Messiaen, you won't find meter. There'll be nothing, so to speak, that you can tap your feet to. Regular cycles of meter are virtually absent in this movement, in this music, and in a lot of his music. And then there are those extraordinary movements of staggering slowness. The 5th movement for solo, cello and piano, for instance, Praise to the Eternity of Jesus. Not only is the pulse exceedingly slow, the shifts of harmony are drastically stretched out, far more than with most Western music. Comes to mind something there, I don't know if you've seen the film Dunkirk, when Hans Zimmer takes a famous piece by Elgar and he stretches effectively, I don't know, must be about 15 seconds in the original. He stretches that out over 2 or 3 minutes. That's what this piece will feel like. It's stretched out. He describes himself. He himself, rather, describes this piece. A broad phrase, infinitely slow on the cello, magnifies with love and reverence the eternity of the word, powerful and gentle, whose time never runs out. Don't miss the love and reverence bit there. We'll come back to that later. It's very crucial. Likewise, the final glorious and soaring duo for violin and piano, which ends the whole work, prays to the immortality of Jesus. It's almost impossibly slow, and its harmonic changes drastically extended. It's no accident that it's actually a transcription of an early organ work, which has the subtitle Essay on Earthly Life and Blessed Eternity. I played the piano part of this piece many times, and I confess to often feeling the need to speed it up just ever so slightly, for fear that the aura of stillness will simply plunge the audience into a prolonged snooze. Along with this is Messiaen's love of reversible rhythms that Rebecca mentioned. Rhythms, that is, that work forwards and backwards in the same way, palindromes, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2. Messiaen explicitly links these with eternity in a number of places. Reversible rhythms are very evident in the 6th movement, the Dance of the Fury, the one that we heard at the opening. And in the 1st movement, the cello repeats a 15-note melody throughout, itself made up of 2 reversible rhythms. Speaking of a much later work, Colours of the Celestial City, which was written to conjure up the kaleidoscopic blaze of the heavenly Jerusalem, he says, "The work does not end, having never really begun. It turns on itself, interlacing its temporal blocks, like the rose window of a cathedral with its vivid, invisible colours." That paradox is very typical of Messiaen, vivid, invisible colours. This Jean-Marie Wu, in a very interesting writing, speaks of a closed circuitry in this music, in which, as Wu puts it, Messiaen finds expression of eternal life. Does this then mean that Messiaen thought of his music as an escape from time? An escape of some sort, anyhow, from time? Well, looking back on 1941, he could indeed say, "If I composed this quartet, it was to escape from the snow, from the war, from captivity, and from myself. The greatest benefit that I drew from it was that in the midst of 30,000 prisoners, I was the only man who was not one. That is, not a prisoner, free." It would seem, anyhow, to suggest that for Messiaen, time is the enemy, the arch problem, and that the Christian's ultimate destiny is to be imagined as the complete absence of all things temporal, a still, static bliss. And this lends weight, this kind of view, incidentally, to the charge of the Marxist and many other critics of Christian faith, that the Christian faith is essentially escapist, deflecting attention from this world towards a supposedly timeless beyond. And yet, I wonder if things are quite so simple. Perhaps there's more going on here than Messiaen admits. To begin with, there's by no means a complete absence of forward motion, of tensions needing resolving in this piece. You take those ultra-slow pieces for cello and violin, both of them trace a very clear arc from a stable opening through tension to an ultimate resolution. The cello piece in particular winds us up to a point of almost unbearable stress before suddenly giving way to the hushed and serene pianissimo that leads to its close. So that's one thing. Another, yes, in this piece he chooses to portray the afterlife as one of timeless stillness, or at least it moves in that direction. But in other works, he portrays it in extremely dynamic terms. Only 2 years before, in his organ recital, translated the glorious bodies, and he's thinking of the resurrection life of the future, when our bodies will be remade, he pulls on Thomas Aquinas' idea that in a heaven our bodies will be agile, mobile as never before. Most of the music is dizzyingly fast, bursting with motion. Here we might say eternal life is much more like running and not growing weary than sitting motionless and never stirring. And in that same word, God the Trinity is no static chord, but an interweaving of three melodic lines. My point is that I think Messiaen's theological imagination was much wider than his words about this quartet suggest, and wider than a superficial hearing of the music might suggest. To be sure, in the Nazi camp of 1941, it's hardly surprising if Messiaen resists some things associated with time as we now experience it. His major enemy, I would suggest, is transience. That is a sense of things passing away. With the quartet in mind, he writes, time is divided in 1,000 ways, of which the most immediate for us is a perpetual conversion of the future into the past. A perpetual conversion of the future into the past. Things perpetually sliding away into an irrecoverable past. Another place, it was in the era of dreadful despair. I found myself in Silesia, a prisoner of war. I was persuaded that I had forgotten about everything about music, that I would never again be capable of doing another harmonic analysis, that never again in my life would I be able to compose. Never again. We always need to remember, though we knew, know now rather, that the war would end, he did not. The ancient fear of what slips into the past, the fear that what slips into the past will be lost forever, that ancient fear, never again. So, in this context, it's hardly surprising if he seeks refuge in something he believes will not fade and not die, the eternal love of God embodied in Jesus. This won't run out. And I think the two great movements that Rebecca said are just extraordinarily beautiful. 5 and 8? I see them primarily not as trying to negate something, but try to affirm something. To affirm something that is not going to be a prisoner of transience and loss and death. The consoling piece of these slogans would surely be balm in this context that he's in. And even more so if the sense of endlessness speaks of God's undying love in a context of so much dying. And no doubt also, we might add, he's probably also haunted by the cruel monotony of prison camp life. In other words, he knows time also as unforgiving, a kind of dehumanizing march. Day after day, he is being managed, regulated, day after day of impersonal routines. In the preface to the third movement there, he writes of the abyss of time with its weariness and gloom. So here time is experienced as exhausting and grey when we're crushed by routine regularities. So in this context, it's hardly surprising if he's going to warm to rhythms that don't, so to speak, lock you into hard, predictable patterns of beats. My suggestion then is that in this context, imprisoned in Silesia, it's little wonder if he's going to concentrate on the things about time that do seem to make it dehumanizing, transience, and crushing predictability. But there are plenty of other contexts, at other times in his life, in other works, where he doesn't seem to be assuming time is itself the problem, something to be defeated. Transience, yes, and that has, he believes, been defeated in the resurrection of Christ, but not time itself, and not change, or motion, or dance, or agility. These are good things, it seems, which in some almost unimaginable way will be taken up in the life of the world to come. He could actually write in one place, I love time. I mean, he even actually say that. And in any case, as many have pointed out, he misreads his key verse from Revelation, there will be no more time. In fact, this has nothing to do with time being abolished. The angel is speaking of the final judgment, and he's telling the church, on that day you will have run out of time. There will be no more time to repent, no more delay. Messiaen did know about that alternative reading, but he dismissed it. That's not what he wanted. It's not what he wanted to hear at the time. It is worth also just underlining here that in the Bible, which of course he takes with intense seriousness, time is not essentially a bad thing. Transient, yes. Loss, death, yes. But not time per se, not change or motion. And in some extraordinary way, the conviction is that change, motion, agility will be taken up in the life of the world to come. Whatever our own faith, I think we need to be careful not to caricature or dismiss Messiaen as a naive and world-denying escapist, longing to flee from this time-bound world into a supposedly timeless eternity. He's much more sophisticated than that, much more subtle, and much more biblically grounded, and of course much more musically interesting too than that might suggest. And I think he's also being perhaps provocative. For if in some sense time can be taken into eternity, as he so often suggests, at least change and motion can be taken into eternity, that pushes us to ask, could there be a kind of time in which there is change, but no transience or loss, in which new things happen, but don't pass away? Perhaps there really is more to this music than meets the ear. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That's really fascinating. And it's great to be able to hear your thoughts on how the music can say so much more in a way than what Messiaen lets on. And I think that's really very fascinating. So now we have a time where we can discuss things together. I thought the polite thing to do would be to let the speakers ask each other some questions first. So Rebecca, I was just wondering, do you have anything you want to ask Jeremy from that talk?
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. That was absolutely beautiful, so poetic, and just so articulate, and your research and your knowledge are just so compelling. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned the alternative reading regarding the angel statement and what Messiaen actually believed, because I found that really fascinating.
He, as you rightly said, Rebecca, he's using that verse as a jumping off point. I mean, there he is, with his book of Revelation, as Daniel was saying, and he reads this, he said, my goodness, there'll be no more time. And he's experiencing, as I try, time really in very understandably in very negative ways. So he jumps on that. No, I need to check the precise wording very carefully, but it's an angel who's saying, he's talking about the final judgment, and he's saying there will come a time when there will be no more time to change, no more time to repent, when the judgment will come. And there won't be any delay then. What the whole book of Revelation is saying, among other things, is that God is delaying his judgment. You think he's doing nothing. In fact, he is, and he's delaying his judgment. But there will be a point at which that will run out. So the translation will be something like, time will run out. But it doesn't mean the abolition of time as a dimension of the created world. That's reading too much into it, I think.
Okay.
May I ask you a question?
Sure, yeah.
When you perform this work, Rebecca, on the Revelation thing, on the interpretation of that, I think, majority of commentators will say that. I haven't found one who said anything in the way Messiaen understands it yet. Maybe there is someone out there, but Messiaen knew about that. He knew about another way of understanding that verse, but it's not what he wanted at the time. It's not what struck him. He was reading this verse and it jumped out at him. No, well, the question I'd like you played this piece often, and how conscious are you of all this history when you perform it? Or is it so demanding, as it is, that you tend to think, oh heck, I've just got to get the non-retrogradable rhythms right here, and I've just got to get that F sharp in tune, and the pianist messed this up in rehearsal, so I just I've got to get it together with them. In other words, here you've spent all these, it must have been many years. It's an extraordinary context you know about, and into this you make your performance. What's that like?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you're absolutely right that the piece is just so demanding. It takes so much rehearsal, and during a lot of these rehearsals, you're just so focused on playing the right rhythm, playing the right notes, playing in tune, playing, both beautiful and ferociously, with a good sound, with an ugly sound, just trying to do everything. But, in the performance, I would say in the performance of it, when I'm sitting back and listening to the violinist play the 8th movement or the cellist play the 5th movement, I sit back in my chair and I am just so struck by the beauty of these movements that I am just even more in awe of the circumstances under which they played, because how Messiaen, I'm just so struck by how he could have maintained his faith in such terrible circumstances, and how he and his fellow musicians could have played such difficult music on, even though Pasquier did have all 4 of his strings, it was still, they were playing inadequate instruments. And the piece is so challenging. So, I would say when I'm practicing the piece and when I'm rehearsing it, I'm pretty caught up in those things. But when I'm sitting back in my chair at the performance and listening to those beautiful 5th and 8th movements, that is when I can just, remember the extraordinary circumstances under which this was composed, and just really appreciate the sheer beauty of the piece,
That's a terrific answer. So it's like the music now speaks back to you, as it were, you having produced it or others having produced it. Now it kind of, it's a wonderful thing. And many performers would say that. Many performers would say that as well. I've only played the slow movements on their own, actually, myself. And I'm still thinking of tempo and how to sustain these extraordinary slow speeds that he asks. But it's very hard not at the same time to be overwhelmed by how moving it is, and to remember the circumstances in which these sounds, perhaps very crudely done, but these sounds first emerge into the world.
Right. And also just, the sheer exhaustion of playing this piece. I mean, it lasts 50 minutes. It is absolutely, just physically, intellectually, emotionally, just very wearing. And to imagine, how exhausting it must have been, at the premiere when they were hungry, they barely got anything to eat. It was freezing cold, with heaters, their fingers were freezing, it's just staggering,
On your point about the impression Messiaen made on these people, that was echoed by a well-known composer here in Britain called Alexander Goer, and Daniel will remember him, who was a pupil of Messiaen. And I said, what in Paris? And I said, what was it like, sort of with him, just kind of reflect on his experiences. And he said, well, all this stuff about colours and birds, we sort of giggled a bit behind his back, but we were overwhelmed by his humility.
Yes,
he had this extraordinary power and lack of vanity and all these things that made an impression on us all as kind of hyper vain, hyper ambitious composers, and I think it's rather nice. And Goer is certainly no believer, not a religious person anyway. It was a very interesting reflection. The same sort of the impression of this personality, obviously, was a key
That
thing.
is, yeah. I didn't mention it today, but in my book, in my interviews with Pasquier, he mentioned how kind and humble Messiaen was, and how open-minded he was in spite of being so religious, because that, isn't always the case when someone is extremely religious, that they're also very open-minded, and Pasquier just touched on that fact that Messiaen was just so humble with whomever he came in contact, and was so respectful of all the great composers before him.
Right. No, thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, about the effect of this piece on people, because you're describing the effect of this quartet, and I often relate Messiaen's quartet to T.S. Eliot's four quartets as an artwork that seems also to have a huge effect on people's lives. So I was just wondering, particularly Rebecca, since you've written the whole book on this, how does the quartet affect you? I mean, what drew you into this research in the first place? Did the quartet actually kind of speak to you in some way?
I'll tell you something a little funny. I'll be completely honest. When I was a doctoral student, I was trying to think of a topic for my dissertation that would enable me to live in Paris, because I wanted to apply for a grant to study in Paris, because I had been there before and I just loved Paris. And I attended, I was a student at a summer music festival, Sarasota, and I heard this piece and it just spoke to me, and I fell in love with it. And I was very lucky because I had a friend who happened to be the French tutor of the great American conductor Kent Nagano, who is now conductor of the Montreal Symphony, but at the time was the conductor of the Lyon Opera Orchestra and the Berkeley Symphony near where I grew up in San Francisco. And he was a great Messiaen specialist. And so through his French tutor, I was able to get the address of Yvonne Loriot, and so I corresponded with her and arranged my initial interview. She was my first contact, and then kind of one thing sort of led to another. And originally I had just, as I said, I'm not a theorist, I'm not a musicologist. Originally I had planned on approaching the study of this piece from the point of view of a performer, but after meeting Pasquier and the Boulez and the Alcoca family, I just said to myself, who cares about the performance of the piece? These people are so fascinating. I would just rather write about them, because their lives, are just so intriguing. So it changed. Initially, I was drawn to the performance of the piece. And then after I did all my research and my interviews, I changed the scope, because I thought it was a fascinating story, and I thought it would be something that could be accessible to the layperson as well as to the musician. And that's what I did when I revised my book. I made a lot of changes to make it more accessible to the layperson, because of course, when you're a music student, there are a lot of technical things that you have to say that you can't, if you're speaking to a wider audience.
So the piece of music basically said, "Come to Paris with me." But it's very interesting, because obviously you met all these people. I mean, is there anything that you were very surprised about, real revelation that came from the interviews with both the violinist and the cellist in particular?
Well, I really felt like when I was doing this research, I felt like a musical detective. I felt like I was sort of searching for clues, and one thing kind of led to another, and then I was discovering this musical mystery. But I think I just was so struck by how unusual this story is. I mean, the fact that the violinist became an actor, a pretty accomplished one, and the fact that the clarinetist escaped from the camp, and, his whole family, he was one of 6 brothers and sisters. Many of them were imprisoned, or hid in the resistance, and their family has just been wonderful to me. They've treated me like one of their family. And so the research of this piece was not just a research project or a book. It really became a part of my life because I still go back to France and meet with members of the Akoka family. Unfortunately, most of the other people I interviewed have since passed away, but it's a part of my life that remains, active. It didn't just die with the publication of the book. I still correspond with these people, and they're still a part of my life.
Yes, it seems to me that all these people were sort of woven together almost providentially, right, into some sort of a miraculous event. Very different people, but every one of them found it actually a transcendental moment in their lives. Jeremy, I was thinking, about the sort of Catholicism in this piece, because in a way, it's a very Catholic piece. I mean, you couldn't really imagine this from a Protestant hand, could you? I mean, do you think this is full of a kind of Catholic textual aesthetic in it?
I don't quite get that, Daniel, actually. I think, could it have been written by a Protestant? That's an interesting question. I don't see it as excessively... What do you see as distinctively Catholic about it?
Well, I mean, the way in which he's able to be so eclectic. I mean, I always see Catholicism as
I right.
pulls in a lot of cultures, right? It's less sort of self-purifying in a way. So, this is a composer that has a huge cosmic view of culture, of humanity, of the universe, right?
Okay.
The love of birdsong, all that kind of stuff would be kind of foreign to a kind of more Protestant feel, if you like. So it has that quality, that kind of rich, baroque, lush, very colourful.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, be careful what I say here. So I would say it depends on the kind of Catholicism you're talking about, because there are other forms of Catholicism that are extremely narrow. That would be quite Messiaen's quite suspect, and likewise, there's plenty of Protestantism, particularly in the 19th century and in the early 20th, which would be similarly almost excessively generous. Eclectic is probably a better way of putting it. I think he's not over worried by the origin of some of the material that he uses.
Right.
Maybe that's very, as far as I can tell, Hindu chants and others. It's not because he's suddenly turned into a Hindu, because he says, "Hey, they've discovered something here that I can incorporate into this vast vision." As far as this particular piece is concerned, I'm not sure that it's quite as well. Of course, it's eclectic, I suppose, in terms of rhythms and so on, but in quite that sense, I don't think it's theologically eclectic quite. But I must think about that. There are other things that very, very much more obviously Catholic. Yeah. But the immortality of Jesus, eternity of Jesus, this is all
That's
very
pretty
standard.
Yes.
Biblical stuff. Yeah. Interesting question, though. Interesting.
Yeah, but it's interesting too that he draws in those slow movements that we've been talking about. I mean, they were actually pieces that are brought into the quartet, right? They were composed earlier, and so they're not really from Revelations. They're really from the Gospel of John. And I'm just curious why you think he would bring that in to this particular piece, apart from having a solo for the violin and a solo for the cello.
Oh, I think because they both speak in their own way of the warmth, the reliability and endlessness of the love of God, and he wants that to be heard in the midst of all this. So that eternity is not just about the absence of something; it's about the presence of a reality that will not die. And he heard in the musical notes, even before he wrote the quartet of these pieces, he heard something of that. He heard something of that warmth and that beauty, a kind of sound that doesn't press you, doesn't strike you, so to speak. I think it's about I haven't quite got the word, but reliability, the endlessness of the warmth of the love of God. That's why he talks particularly about reverence and love. he says a lot about love elsewhere. And you mentioned John's Gospel. Yes, I mean, he's very much the musician of John's Gospel and the Book of Revelation. In other words, if they were both written by John, then that's not surprising.
Yes. And I love the way, Jeremy, you talked about how his musical technique, his language, which he also likes to write about, in many ways is far more complicated in his expression of time than some of his own statements, particularly about in this quartet. And I wanted to ask Rebecca whether, in a way, Messiaen spent a lot of his time in prison working on his theory of music, because he wasn't just composing the quartet for the end of time, but actually, I think wasn't he locked away in a latrine or something so that he could compose in peace? He must have spent a lot of time just thinking about how do I write a piece that somehow has to talk about the end of time in music that obviously is full of time, right? And then I think just a few years later, he comes up with this, treatise on his musical language, on his technique.
Yeah.
But even in the quartet itself, the preface before you see the score, he's already talking about this is my technique. So he must have been in prison working on theory, not just on composing.
That's a
Right.
fascinating thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, his treatise on rhythm is very important, and so he must have been working on that as well. I mean, I didn't have the good fortune to interview Messiaen. His death was kind of my inspiration, because he died in 1992, and that's when I became interested in the piece. But from what I've read, he was working on his ideas about rhythm for quite some time.
Right, because yeah, sorry, Jeremy.
So I'm just going to say, it's a fact. I've never really thought about that properly before. You're dead right that there is something extraordinary about in these extreme circumstances. You should worry about things that many would regard as fairly abstruse and over theoretical. I think it's a fascinating. It's a fascinating thing to ponder.
Something, in a very extreme situation. As you said, he felt free. He was not a prisoner in prison, as it were.
That's right.
Thinking about these things, right? And all these sort of more circular concepts, if you like, of rhythmic composition, which is fascinating. We have a question here for you, Jeremy, about timelessness. So it sort of fits in.
Oh my
Could you say a little bit more about timelessness for Messiaen and for Christianity in general? This is fascinating. I've thought time is something essential to being human, and wonder what life would be like without it. It's hard to imagine.
Well, stepping into Messiaen's biblical Catholicism, I think what he's saying is, and what the tradition would largely say, is that time, the fact that things take time to be what they are, is not a bad thing. So that time is not the thing to be escaped. That time is a dimension of the created world, clearly, and certainly a dimension of being human. As you rightly say, hard to imagine what life will be like without it. In fact, how could we talk about life or liveliness without something akin to time? So that's the way I think he's viewing it. Where it becomes more complex is if in his world, if you're thinking about the afterlife, the life of the world to come, what I'm suggesting is there's enough in his music and in what he writes to suggest that a model of it is the negation of everything to do with time, like change and movement and motion, whatever, is too simple. It's just not like that. Eternal life is, first of all, the eternal life of God, and that's lively in some sense. And to take part in that means, in some sense, liveliness. And although it splits our mind open to think about it, I think what he's pushing for, and certainly what the Bible is pushing for, is the idea of time as healed, time as redeemed, a kind of time in that great picture of running and not growing weary, doing something very energetic and not getting tired. There you've got motion, but you haven't got loss, transience, death. And I think it's that kind of time that he's envisaging in the future. Very carefully, in all this, I mean, oversimplify it, it's very easy to think of eternity and time as polar opposites kicking against each other. He is saying that it's not as simple as that. Eternity has a life of its own and can some way take even time into that life and redeem it from loss. Complex stuff, Daniel. It's about as... And thank you for that.
Make it more complex for you, and maybe for Rebecca, because it strikes me that that Messiaen, in a way, is just being paradoxical here. He's talking about the end of time, and he's writing a piece of music. So my question really is whether Messiaen is really saying that music has a way of articulating time theologically, in thinking of this, that only music can do it. In this way. He does the same with silence. Right. He says the first movement is about silence, right? It's it's not very silent to me, right? And I think Jean Lanier, the violinist, also said by the time you get to the last movement, it's just the silence of heaven. But obviously it's music.
I know.
So he must be making some comment about the nature of music and articulating another type of time or silence.
You said it, Daniel. You said it. I think he would say, gosh, it's so presumptuous to he would say, I get the impression from a lot of what he's not only saying but writing that he would say music can evoke, it can't replicate, but evoke, gesture towards a kind of time in which past, present and future fold into each other. A time that doesn't involve fragmentation of past, present and future. The ever receding past, the future we can't touch. I think he thinks music can give you a hint, a taste, a gesture towards living in a kind of time that is fulfilling, that doesn't involve these negative things that I was talking about. But he's forever wrestling. You see, he doesn't want it to be pure stillness, but he doesn't want it to be kind of pounding drivenness. He wants something in between, a kind of enriching form of time. And actually, to come back to Rebecca's thing about humility, I just wonder if his own life, his own way with people suggested a kind of trust and a kind of patience and not having to force things. Isn't that an example of someone living, so to speak, peaceably with and in time rather than always fighting against it? Just a crazy reflection, but I'll leave that with you.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely so true. I was struck when I was doing this research, the differences between these four principal musicians. Here was Messiaen, the devout Catholic. Then you had Akoka, the Trotskyist secular Jew. Then you had Pasquier, the agnostic, and you had Le Boulez, the atheist. And yet all these men got along wonderfully. And,
very interesting.
It's just a beautiful story, and just shows how tolerant they all were of each other.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting. I think you mentioned, Rebecca, in your book at the Paris premiere. So this is now outside the prison. That one of the critics didn't like the sort of what he regarded as Messiaen's very naive Catholic pontifications, in explaining the music beforehand. And then there was a question really here about how this music then can be understood. Going back to your comment just now, really in whether you need the Catholic trappings, as it were, to really get it, or maybe we can just either bracket it off, or maybe in a strange way, as you were saying about the other musicians with other beliefs, somehow they all entered into this Christian world, as it were, but without necessarily having to believe in it, as it were. But somehow it brought something of that to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I'm struck by the beauty and the terror of this music. I think the reason it's so powerful is that, you can be religious or you can be an atheist, and yet this music still speaks to you. You don't have to be Catholic to appreciate the Quartet for the End of Time. You don't need to know anything about the Bible to appreciate this piece, because the music itself, even if you just divorce it from the religious context is so compelling. And yet, when you think about the religious context in the historical context in which it was premiered, you know, it's earth-shattering, really.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're almost coming to the end of time for this lecture. But there's something that maybe we can reflect on a little bit, which is about Messiaen's own narrative. Because, you know, it seems to me that he's alluding to something like the feeding of the 5,000. So he imagines there are 5,000 people, right? And he has this cello that has only 3 strings. So it's like, you know, he has like only 5 loaves and 2 fish, as it were. You know, that's all that there is. And yet, this miracle happens in this prison camp. And, well, he's messianic in the sense that somehow the music is able to feed 5,000 people. So in a way, it's a kind of a parable, if you like, rather than an actual history of what happened in that camp. Because it's quite true from the accounts that Rebecca reports that, you know, the prisoners had no idea what had happened, but they were totally silent in the process. Yeah. And somehow they had been fed. Yeah.
Right, they didn't understand it. The music was beyond them, and yet they were completely respectful. They were just so in awe. You know, as I wrote, it's like Messiaen was leading them all in a musical prayer.
Yeah, any final comments, Jeremy?
No, I think Rebecca put it well there. I love her language of miracle and resurrection towards the end. I think I hadn't thought of it as a kind of feeling of. Just the very sound of compelling music in such weariness and gloom, to use his phrase, says a great deal. Thank you very much.
We will play some of the first movement so that you can actually drift off into an unmeasured evening or morning or afternoon, depending where you are. But thank you so much, Rebecca and Jeremy. It's been an amazing,
thank you very, very much.
Insightful time.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you from the University of Hong Kong.